A Challenge to Dignity. Our goal was to link academics, activists, and agencies concerned with the health of refugees and asylum seekers in a spirit of collaboration and comparison, bringing together professionals working with different populations of forcibly displaced peoples, ethnic groups, and nations. The video you are watching will contain all the presentations in one of 5 thematic sessions. We hope you find them to be of value.
Today, what I want to do is talk a little bit about ways community engagement happen and the way we articulate it, the way we construct it, through giving you examples of inclusive approaches to programming in context of forced displacement. Can you hear me? Yeah. So I'm going to give you some examples that take the lens of resilience, humanitarianism, social entrepreneurship, and social justice. And on this conference of dignity, dignity is often invoked in context of displacement. Here's a literature of the review of the literature by the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI in the UK, which simply says that there's a principle of humanitarian action that all people have equal value and dignity. And so one of the questions asked in this report is is dignity enhanced or diminished in displacement settings? And the new ways of working with refugees advocated by UNHCR is about a whole society approach, a phrase used in context of the Global Compact for Refugees that is inherently inclusive. The whole society approach recognizes that civil society actors are catalysts for change, and that the way to make change for refugees is by including businesses, media, social organizations, doctors, churches, etc., all together working to change the discourse on refugee migration. And these coalitions exist to improve well-being, improve the lives and livelihoods of refugees. So I will take a minute to give 2 contrasting examples of community-based collective action, one based on resilience humanitarianism and one based on social entrepreneurship. And I draw from personal experience of fieldwork, but also personal experience of partnerships in projects that other people have conducted. Resilience humanitarianism is exemplified by the NGO Mercy Corps, which is an international non-governmental organization that says it partners with local people to put bold ideas into action. And it has worked in Jordan in particular for putting individual and collective community-based initiatives on behalf of Syrian and Iraqi refugees. The social entrepreneurship example I will exemplify with We Love Reading, a foundation in Jordan that fosters learning and empowerment through people-driven change, skills learning, and confidence building, which is an initiative grown in Jordan, exported onto the global stage. And an interesting counterexample to the usual model of Western organization exporting help and support to resource-poor, low opportunity contexts. So both examples, what they do, aim to example of community engagements that aim to change the mindsets and transform architecture of humanitarian assistance, the frames. They change the mind and they change the frames of ways of delivering help to refugees. And when cause of human dignity come to the fore, the former here is working with a global agenda to partner with local communities. And the second one is catalyzing a local approaches onto the global stage. So let me just give the first example, which is resilience humanitarianism. The one I was involved with is examining the impacts of an 8-week stress attunement intervention implemented with war-affected youth, both Syrian refugees and Jordanian host communities. It was called Advancing Adolescent, and its aims were ambitious to alleviate toxic stress, improve learning, build resilience, and heal conflict. And I don't want to talk too much about this, but just to say that what this research that I led did was with partnerships, humanitarian partnerships in Mexico, and partnerships with Jordanian and Syrian refugee and scholars, it was to examine the biological, cognitive, and psychosocial dimension of well-being. And to highlight two things, it was kind of inspiring to Syrian communities themselves that we could trace the impact of this intervention through tiny samples of hair, because in hair is deposited the hormone cortisol, which functions as a biological stress diary. So by looking at hair before and after the intervention, we could demonstrate that stress levels amongst refugees had fallen by a third, which corroborated with their experiential understanding of stress. The research was complemented also with narratives of resilience and social inclusion and measures of this critical learning skill that we need in order to move forward with life. So the project is really about connecting the stress biology with human experience. And this image that was drawn on the walls of a refugee center by a Syrian young man shows that it is only once you are able to connect your emotions in your heart with your goals in your brains that you will have the wings to fly and to move forward in adversity. So it helps connect a very critical biological experience of stress to a emotional and cognitive experience of stress. And I'm highlighting that this research was conducted with my partner, Dr. Rana Dejani from Jordan, who is herself a scientist and a professor at Hashemite University, and also a social innovator in founding an organization that looks after or helps work with low-resource communities in Jordan. The narratives of Syrian refugees were evidently portraying themselves as having the agency to realize their dreams, the right to live in dignity, and the hope to gain social respect. So we're tying very carefully well-being to issues of dignity and social inclusion, as you might expect. And to then summarize what resilience humanitarianism and key aspects of this does in terms of community engagement was that it allowed a humanitarian organization like Mercy Corps to put forward a more broad package of refugee well-being and community engagement by doing exactly this, by linking improvements in human health, which in this case were to alleviate stress in the body and the mind, with economic opportunities, which is in this case linking the trajectories of young refugees that went into this program to economic opportunities by linking with businesses in society, and a more meaningful participation in society, which promoted dignity. So I characterize this community engagement approach by seeing how alleviating stress and boosting resilience is actually linked very explicitly with issues of social inclusion and human dignity. Now, the second example is quite different for interesting reasons. This is Rana Dejani, who founded the Foundation Tagir, with its flagship We Love Reading in Jordan, which inspires children to read for fun, training local volunteers to read to the children in their neighborhoods. It is a community-based intervention which mobilizes men, women, and adults and young and youth to establish informal libraries and to organize read-alone sessions for young people in the public spaces, whether these are mosques or trees or railway stations or restaurants. And it's a model that has diffused throughout the world by reaching 52 countries, including North America, teaching refugees, helping refugee families read their children, Australia, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. By training 500,000 children and distributing 250,000 books and training 7,000 people through this program, half of whom have become reading ambassadors. At the bottom, the reading ambassador is somebody who takes on this initiative of reading in their neighborhood, but then creates further models for change. For example, a guy called Matuvo in Uganda is putting together a coffee business in order to be able to sustain the economic activity of wheeler breathing. So this is a model that grows by disproportionate impact, by diffusion from one person to their person. All these volunteers are unpaid, and it grows by diffusion rather than the normal scale up that we are used to in an intervention. These communities are the ones co-designing books for children so that they become very culturally relevant. They help draw the books for children. These are examples to raise environmental awareness in Jordan with respect to garbage collection, water, and electricity use. These are books to encourage a level of learning. In a book called Questions in a Suitcase, this is the page that says, the kid says, I ask myself each night, why I'm trying to fall asleep. Sometimes I find one answer to my problem, and sometimes I find 13. So the idea is not to encourage a love of reading for education or for religious purposes. It is literally to think and to have fun with thoughts. And this is a page of the book to address issues of social inclusion, where the caption says, do birds need passport to enter Hungary? Where young refugees are each portrayed as a bird holding their passport in their beak and everything they have on their backs and trying to cross borders in order to find food security and inclusion somewhere in Europe. So this kind of program has actually been also rigorously evaluated by inviting Western scientists from Chicago and Harvard and elsewhere to look at their impacts on reading practices, on the development of empathy in children, on parent-child interaction, including fathers reading to their children, and on the executive function of the brain of the kid. But also, interestingly, on a global network of ambassadors, whereby a woman in Zaatari camp can reach out to somebody in Colombia or Uganda through this a mobile app that connects people together, functioning as connectivity. So to illustrate the change that's happening in the community through agency, local ownership of the program and responsibility, the picture on the left shows women caught in limbo of living in refugee camps. The woman on the right, Esma Rashid, is a wheeler reading ambassador who takes it upon herself to read to children in her community to create change in her community. And her story has been featured in the New York Times and Forbes and the Stanford Innovation Review, but is going to be made into a documentary because it's been picked up by a foundation in Dubai called Home Storytellers that tells that for refugees, connectivity is key. And then this notion of radical empathy with refugees is also key. So this documentary is coming out in November. So the key aspects of this second model of social entrepreneurship is really to link human refugee well-being to notions of agency, ownership, because they're doing the program by themselves, and lifelong learning. And Rana characterized this as a changing mindset through reading to create change makers in the community. It is, I would say, a grassroots system that develops entrepreneurial capacities in men, women, and youth, that supports well-being, competencies, and agency amongst adults and children, and supports lifelong learning and development in kids. And that's all I'm going to say about this example. And now I'm going to try and contrast these two examples with a third approach, which is to enhance well-being through actions of social justice. And in this room is a lot of expertise on the border, so I just want to contrast what I found surprising about grassroots humanitarianism on the US-Mexico border in contrast to the experience I had with working with Syrian and Jordanian scholars and Syrian Jordanian communities in Jordan. So this comes from fieldwork in 2018 and 2019 in Brownsville, McAllen, El Paso, and Tijuana. And what I did there was to ask, so what I didn't know before I went to the US-Mexico border is how engaged civic and faith-based organizations are in trying to change mindsets and discourse on migration. And again, all I'm going to say today is what I found surprising. One of the things I found surprising or hadn't realized is that the message of Christian charity is rooted in two feet of love. One is justice and one is charity. So that the notion of justice is very high on the agenda in terms of service to the other. One social activist reminded me of this quote from St. Augustine, which I find very beautiful, that hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger, visible injustice, and courage to bring about change. And those are some of the quotes I kind of threaded together in this paper that looks at the calls for solidarity that are rooted in human dignity and collective action on the border. Another thing that I wasn't quite prepared for was how thin the line was between anger and courage and pain and love. And we just heard Dr. Murphy talk about both rage and anger in terms of acting towards visible injustice. And this is a form of more combative solidarity rather than just a compassion solidarity that was expecting on the border. And I want to just read one quote from a social activist who said, "This is a world of pain. It is very personal, the struggle for refugees and migrants. It's sometimes of pure rage that I do this work, but also of pure love. To exist and to work in this space is really to hold a painful tension between love and pain. It feels like spiritual warfare." And so what this person is saying in Tijuana is actually that there is a struggle, which is like a war going on, which is fueled by rage as well as by love, and that anger is the driver to change systems found to be toxic, whereas compassion is a driver to support people who are suffering. And so it's surprising to me that anger functions as this cognitive good that is not counterproductive, but that it mobilizes collective action to make a change in terms of systems change. I think I'm coming to my conclusion. Yeah, there it is. That calls to foster human dignity and community engagement, therefore, can be multifaceted. You have one where you see it through the lens of resilience, to make a change in the community, to help refugees move forward. You have one that makes a change through this sense of entrepreneurial agency and giving ownership to people to be change makers in their communities. And you have one that is through the lens of social justice, that makes a more, wants to make more of a systemic change with respect to refugee well-being. And to my mind, it speaks to the kinds of impacts that we can have in scholarly work. And I see 4 kinds of impacts and would like to end here. So 2 kinds of impacts are conceptual and instrumental. The conceptual impact is to change your mindsets about refugees and the knowledge that you have about them, which is a little bit the way that Dr. Ortega and Dr. Burgos started with, is that just by taking action in your community, you change mindsets about what you think refugees are. And the second is instrumental by changing policy or practice. And so this is an example of my work with Mercy Corps, whereby doing the bicultural work to connect stress biology with human experience, you end up by changing policy or practice, really, because then human well-being is no longer seen as a nice thing to have in terms of refugee work, but a must thing to have, because before you can put together your mind and your body and move forward in terms of economic and social opportunities, but all this is tied together. So it broadens the package of intervention, and that's an instrumental change. The last 2 changes are capacity building, which means that we change our capacities to work as a result of doing this kind of work with refugees or on behalf of refugees, or community engagement, and connectivity, whereby we shape the existence and strength of networks. A perfect example to me is the We Love Reading initiative, which through social entrepreneurship changes the capacity of women to feel that they are change makers in the society, and putting them within a global network of reading ambassadors throughout the world. But we also have that example through Dr. Murphy's recent, just now, presentation about the strength of networks across medical doctors, for instance, and that capacity or that mentorship, the mentorship that we have each other changes our capacity to work on behalf of refugees. So for me, the impact that our work has in these 4 dimensions is really crucial. Have I got 1 minute? No. Okay.
Well, we can move to questions, and whatever you were going to say in that last message can be an answer to a question. Questions?
Hi, thanks, Catherine. So I was inspired by one of your slides about the We Love Reading in your models of growth. So one said linear and one said, I don't know if it was organic.
Diffusion, yeah.
Diffusion, yeah. So I was curious if you could say more about what the sort of mechanism is for growth and what that's based on. I'm thinking about like Nicholas Christakis' work looking at different types of interventions and different nodes of the network that you intervene in and how you might study and understand better how that growth sort of takes place. And so as connectivity is one of the main things here, could you say more about sort of what they actually did to sort of trigger that more multimodal, whatever, nodal?
Yeah. So I think the organization started with 3 trainees and has now, gone to thousands. And it's interesting what you say, because I'm just about to start a social network analysis of We Love Reading, which is why I'm trying to understand how it does work. And I'm not sure social network analysis is a really appropriate analysis, because these are, so basically what you're asking is how did the people come forth? How did they train and how do they
recruit them? Do they go to leaders? Do they go to lay people? Do they interview churches? Like what?
It's basically, I get trained and then I tell my Tom friend, who then tells his friend Seth, who then tells his friend Teresa. And then an organization. So the point about is that this organization has won multiple awards, the UNESCO Literacy Award for Refugees. She's just had the Forbes Social Entrepreneur 2021 Award for this year, which is still on top secret news. And she's had so many awards for social innovation, for refugee and for literacy, that organization hear this and see that the costs are minimal and it is really a homegrown solution. So again, Colombia, a local organization, Colombia, hears about it through the network of NGOs that distribute these awards, and then contacts her to make something happen in the local community. It's that informal. And so what they do now is, instead of relying on grants to seed the project, they rely on word of mouth and partnering with institutions and communities. So if you want to do one in San Diego, you'll just be able to do it by yourself with some kind of training and support. The training is just 6 or 7 hours. But the mobile app helps you keep together and move together for the organization and send your data about the hours that you're reading, you're reading, who you're reading to, and that kind of thing. So it's very informal, but at the same time structured so that they make and so the books, for instance, that you are producing in your community might actually get funded by somebody like UNESCO, right? Or at the moment she's funded by many Dubai foundations. She's getting money from Korea. So these foundations are coming in saying, this is a great idea. How do we make it work in our community for our people? And if she were here, she would explain it much better than I.
Thank you very much.
But I think that's a pretty interesting model of community engagement.
And mediated by technology.
And what?
Mediated by
technology and mediated by the creating the change maker in the community. You don't want to see my last slide.
Mm-hmm. Show it to us, please.
No, if I'm late, I'm okay.
No. We have.
Okay.
There's no additional.
So sorry. My last slide was this one. Is that in thinking about Syrian refugees, we have examples of focuses on trauma and suffering on the left-hand side and focuses on confidence and on the right-hand side. And this is a photo of Aya Riri, whose family is basically, who took part in, who was photographed by Mohamed Muhaisin, who's a Syrian photographer, who is a 2 times Pulitzer Prize winner for advocating for his community in Syria, Jordan, Europe, and other places, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And I find that those images are strikingly different. And I would argue that I like the pivot from trauma and suffering to confidence and hope in ways that we are portraying, in ways that the media is portraying. The media and scholarly and humanitarian research come together to portray young refugees. And I think my whole society approach point is that as scholars, we have built some kind of knowledge to have some kind of impact on mindsets, but also on portrayals of refugees. And when I first saw that picture on the right, which is a documentary that showcases the research and the connectivities that we established with communities and scholars and humanitarian workers, I was very uncomfortable until I started to know that Aya's family had sponsored the picture and that the proceeds of the picture were going to a foundation helping refugees, which is not the same kind of extractive knowledge that we've been using pictures before. And I'll end there. Thank you very much for your time.
I've gotten a lot of screenings at film festivals, all those little palms down at the bottom.
Yeah.
There. So it's been
it's a unique documentary because it basically asks what can science do on behalf of refugees. And it's also been shown by NIH Fogarty to precipitate conversations about how program officers can work in humanitarian contexts, but also on other kinds of festivals. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, presenter. And now we're switching over to remote format. Is Dr. Charles Waters, who is professor of Wellbeing and Social Care and the director of doctoral studies in the School of Education and Social Work at Sussex University. And Professor Waters will be speaking to us from Sussex. And we are thankful to him for devoting his evening, because it's 8 hours later there, to our conference.
Hopefully you can hear and see me. I'm just going to share screen. Right. Okay. That should work. I hope it's all working. Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks. Okay, so first of all, it's a great pleasure to join you. I was hoping to be there in person, but one of the glitches of the COVID world is that the US doesn't accept AstraZeneca vaccines, which are the predominant form that's administered in the UK. So, and that ban is actually going to be lifted on the 8th of November, so I've just missed it. But I was all ready to come, and I'm delighted I could join you anyway by remote technology. So I'm actually sitting in Canterbury at the moment, and that's kind of significant. What I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of background about who I am and what I'm doing, and then lead into addressing the key issue of dignity and offer some reflections on that based on my current research projects. So if I could just move forward, this is where the University of Sussex is situated. But I just want to cast your eye to the right, where you see the ports of Dover and Folkestone. And this, as I'll come on to elaborate, is a scene of considerable drama at the present time, with escalating numbers of people arriving in the UK from France and also from Belgium, who've traveled across the world to try and get to the UK. And I'm going to explore that in relation to the central theme of dignity. So just a word about my institute at the University of Sussex. It's a 60s university. And I'm based, as Tom said, within the School of Education and Social Work. My background academically is primarily in anthropology. I'm the director of the Center for Innovation and Research and Wellbeing. And the school is very interdisciplinary. So we have a lot of collaboration across anthropology, education, social work, sociology, psychology, in many research projects. So my current research projects, and I'm going to talk about the first two of these, are on refugee children's well-being at school. And that's a European Union funded initiative with partners in Belgium, UK, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Norway, and France. And the second one I'm going to say something about is one which we're doing in collaboration with the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex, which is looking at migrants and placemaking, particularly in urban areas. And I'm very interested in the relationship between placemaking and well-being. And we're looking at the situation in UK, Finland, India, and Norway. And a third project is looking at coastal erosion and how that impacts on vulnerable people in Thailand and affects their well-being. So much of my research, it's been pretty global, but most of the time has concentrated on the situation in Europe, particularly those people crossing from North Africa, across the Mediterranean, landing in places like Malta, Italy, and going on a journey through Europe. I may take them to France, Germany, sometimes on to Scandinavian countries. And that's going to be primarily the focus of my attention. So just a quick word about the schools project. It's a large-scale European funded project looking at psychosocial interventions for refugee and migrant adolescents in schools. We're just about coming to the end of the project. It's due to finish in March, but we may have an extension to September 2022. And it's implemented in 6 European countries, 5 of which are in the European Union. Guess which one isn't? With Belgium, Ghent is the main coordinating institution. And then we've got partners across Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and the UK, with additional partners in France and Portugal. So it's focused on evaluating the effectiveness and implementation processes of following 5 preventative school-based interventions. And one of the innovative aspects of it is that these interventions are being explored in the context of more than one country. So for example, the peer intervention, which is about peer interactions, enhancing peer interactions in schools, it was developed by myself and my research assistant, Emma Soy, and that's been introduced into schools in the UK and Finland. And the drama program was actually initiated at McGill, subsequently used in Leuven and Ghent, and then also was introduced in the UK. So we've got this very interesting trajectory of developing interventions and looking at their effectiveness in terms of a number of psychosocial indicators in schools. So we use a broad conceptualization of mental well-being, reduce mental health problems, increase resilience, increased academic achievements, and reduce school dropout, increase social support networks. So I'm going through this quite briefly because I'm trying to cover quite a bit of territory in this short presentation. So we're looking at the evaluation of these the implementation of these interventions, their effectiveness, how contextual factors have influenced them. And it's, of course, we've been doing this in the time of COVID, and that's been a major feature of our evolving analysis. The implementation process itself, and interestingly, we have a partner at Uppsala in Sweden that's looking at the economic impact, which I think is incredibly important in persuading governments and intergovernmental bodies to look at introducing these programs in schools. So we've had a very robust economic analysis. So this just gives you a sense of the scale of the research, the number of kids involved, 3,632, the parents, teachers, the number of schools, 93 schools, and the number of countries involved. So you can obviously learn much more about the project in further detail on its website. But I just wanted to introduce this because as I will come on to, I think, demonstrate it, the kind of orientation of this research is, I think, significant in terms of addressing issues of well-being and dignity of asylum seekers and refugees. So I'm moving on to questions of dignity, and I'm now bringing our attention to what's happening just really quite close to where I'm sitting, which is this dramatic human movement across the English Channel, the stretch of water between France and Britain. And over the last 2 or 3 decades, there's been literally over 100,000 people, perhaps much more than that, accumulating across the French coast and in the Belgian coast, and trying, often desperately, to get from Belgium or France to the UK. And I think this phenomenon is terribly interesting when we think about issues of agency and well-being. Just in the last month, in September, there's some 160 boats with 4,638 people have been crossing the channel. Now, in terms of how the government and much of the media in the UK represents this, it's all through a discourse of criminality. And there's much attention given to people smugglers and the effect of this journey on minors. Interestingly, in the Times in London tomorrow, there's a large investigation into child refugees who have crossed the channel and possible involvement in criminality, exploitation, and so on. So this is the preponderant discourse. So scenes like this are really, really quite common across the South Coast in ports such as Dover, Folkestone, Hastings, and so on. people arriving on the shore, often little dinghies with maybe 40 to 80 people crammed into them. And taking a journey that is incredibly precarious, incredibly dangerous. And one of the images that many people who've witnessed the arrival of refugees in the UK note is how joyful they often are, like we've made it, a great deal of exhaustion, excitement, relief at making this journey. Just trying to move, oops. So one of the issues that I have been addressing in my academic work, in my book on refugee children, or recent book on mental health and well-being, intercultural perspectives, is the role of aspiration in the migratory process. I've focused quite a lot, not just on what's pushing people out of countries, but exploring dreams and aspirations. And that's taken my research to ports such as Zeebrugge in Belgium, where many thousands of young people have stowed away in the backs of trucks trying to get to the UK. And one of my early experiences in Zeebrugge was to sit in a holding center where the police take young people and notice the etchings on the walls. And with a colleague in Ghent University, we visited these holding centers. This is just before we went to the cells more recently, where one of the poignant images was some Iranian men had etched the image of a Union Jack, a UK flag, in the concrete in their cell. And we had previously got some of the inscriptions translated and appeared in the Journal of Refugee Studies. This is Ilse de Leeuwen, who I work with, who's in the photograph, and explored what these messages on the walls meant. And many of the people were encouraging others, or giving warnings, in this case about the dog in the port, but encouraging others to persevere in their journey to reach Britain. So I just want to say something, and I'm always mindful of time, on the issue of social inclusion and what I refer to as the paradox of social inclusion. And this takes me to Sweden, where I traveled many times over the years looking at migrants who had arrived there. Sweden's been comparatively generous in taking asylum seekers, but I've often been quite concerned at the poor integration of migrants. This is a suburb outside Stockholm, Rinkeby, where it's a very, very segregated area where the migrants are, and one doesn't see so many migrants within the rest of the capital outside certain specific suburbs. This is in Gothenburg. I was invited to give a talk at the opening of a wing for migrants who had large numbers of health problems, mental health problems, depression, addictions, and so on, and combined with high rates of unemployment. And one of the features of the Swedish situation that has been of concern is the extent to which periodically there's an explosion and people riot. This is in Gothenburg, 2018, when cars were burnt, and there's been periodic episodes of this kind. So one of the concerns with the Swedish situation, and it relates directly to the issue of dignity and the issue of well-being, is that on one level, if one thinks of well-being in terms of the classic Aristotelian definitions around hedonic and eudaimonic happiness, one could say that people are doing okay. They get welfare benefits. There's okay housing. They get their kids go to school, but there is very, very high levels of unemployment and very poor social integration. So, and this is from the National Public Health Report in Sweden, which was authored by a colleague of mine, Anders Yarris, who I've worked with a good deal over the years, about segregation and discrimination in the housing market. But also one of the big themes that's present in the Swedish situation is the frustration of second generation. Anders has noted that in schools, the kids of migrants tend to do well, but they then have very poor prospects in the employment market. And this produces high levels of frustration among the young people. So the situation in Sweden is part of a tapestry of reception of asylum seekers, which I've been mapping over the years. And I tentatively suggested different forms of models if you look across Europe. And this is very schematic, you know, it's always difficult to work with these generalizations, but I think it's not unreasonable to point to what could be called a northern model, which consists of residential segregation, high levels of unemployment, welfare benefits, and kind of supportive housing, but very poor longer term prospects, and which manifests in terms of frustration in our longitudinal studies show an increase in depression and so on after migration. And then a southern model, which is much more light touch, much less involvement of the state, minimal social control, often overt discrimination. And I'll just, in interest of time, just mention also a Western model, as it were, which involves rapid integration, high ethnic diversity, but much more social mobility. So in terms of the how migrants and refugees are incorporated, I think there's two kind of predominant modalities. One is not incorporating at all, exclusion, people being pushed out at borders. And where inclusion is enacted, it's often in a context of what may be termed, by following Foucault, biolegitimacy, with an overriding emphasis on the mental health problems, trauma in particular, of refugees, and often refugee children in particular, what Didier Fassin refers to as the empire of trauma. And I think those two modalities are significant and both highly problematic. And when one is considering the quest for enhancing dignity among refugee populations, one has to look beyond them and challenge them. So one of the big questions, and I'm conscious of time, so I don't want to overreach the 20 minutes too much, but how do we understand the situation in Calais and Zeebrugge? Because on the one hand, we have France and Belgium, and on the other, the UK, they have relatively similar GDP. They are all seen as safe countries, yet people risk their lives in increasing numbers to get from one to the other. Why is that? And I think if you run through a whole range of potential questions, I think the last one is and I have to condense my arguments here, is the most important and telling. It's about aspiration for secure and long-term future. It's a perception, at least, that that may be possible. So the migration is, I would argue, a pursuit of well-being and a pursuit of dignity. It goes beyond hedonic well-being, as it were, towards more of a quest for a sense of a fulfilled and meaningful life. That dichotomies of push and pull are within individual migrants. And cross-channel migrants reflect a much larger migratory move from continental Europe to the UK. For example, large-scale migration of migrants who've settled initially in Holland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, who've subsequently given up there and gone to Britain. So I'm almost at the end. This is from, and I think the previous presentation by Dr. Panter-Brick was quite resonant with many of my themes. But this is based on current work I'm doing with Emma Soy, who's my researcher, on responses of NGOs to migrants and refugees in the UK. And we're gathering evidence of what does enhance placemaking. And I just want to pick up on really two of these that may be less focused on in some of the literature. One is the working with the natural environment and the role of nature-based initiatives, which I could say more about, but without time. And the other is the importance of reciprocity, because one of the big problems in many contexts is refugees just feeling they're recipients of care and concern, not able to exercise agency and demonstrate reciprocity. And we've gathered many examples where this has been extremely important to the well-being of refugees. So I'm just going to stop there and concluding that migration is essentially also a pursuit of well-being and of dignity. So thank you.
Eastern model.
Oh, sorry, I've only just heard the question.
Oh, okay. So the question again is, when you show the slides of the different regional models within Europe.
Yes.
You had one that was an Eastern model, but it didn't have any gloss to it. What is the Eastern model?
Okay, so let me just give you quickly some context on this. This was a study I led, which was commissioned by the European Commission, where I was looking at modalities of reception, and I looked at 16 countries around Europe. And we looked at 3 countries in Eastern Europe. And they were just really emerging as reception countries, because they were often countries that migrants passed through, often experiencing pretty hostile conditions, but hadn't really operated as a country which had developed mechanisms for receiving asylum seekers. And many of I characterize the Eastern model as often using disused army barracks to house asylum seekers with very, very segregated accommodation and often informal practices of letting people leave the country rather than going through the asylum process within the country, with very low rates of asylum recognition. So those are just a few bullet points. Had I time, I would have elaborated further on.
Thanks. Other questions?
I thought this was an excellent presentation. I really appreciated it. And Teresa Betancourt from Boston College. And we are now anticipating in the United States this rather large influx of Afghan SIV and parolee populations. And I'm very interested in what you've seen about policies and programs that really enhance dignity and integration. And if you were advising the US government right now, what core pieces of advice would you be recommending to enhance better outcomes?
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate the question. Just to say, one of my big experiences in this area was many, many years ago. I was attending an event in Birmingham, which was being run by Somali refugees. And at the end of the event, I got a lift somewhere, I can't remember where, with a whole group of Somalis in a bus. And I was asking them, where are you from initially? And they all said they'd left Holland to come to the UK. They were all Dutch. They'd got citizenship in Holland. And this kind of really took me aback, because I thought, why would anyone want to leave Holland to go to the UK? So I asked them this, and they said, well, because here we can form our own societies. We can have our own community groups. You know, we feel freer. And this is something that's really interesting. Just a few years later, I was invited by Utrecht University to give a paper on what they referred to as the British model, which was having lots of diverse community groups and encouraging them through local government funding. So even in areas of London like Croydon, I supervised a dissertation which was looking at drug and alcohol services for refugees in Croydon. In that area, there were dozens of organizations, many of them run by migrants and refugees. And I think this is I think the issue of agency and autonomy and reciprocity are incredibly important. And I would be advising a kind of blended approach that ensured a basic, a due regard to needs such as healthcare, education, so on, but also match with opportunities for acting more autonomously. In some ways, I think Nussbaum and Sen's work on capabilities can be quite resonant here, in striking a balance between, just giving people support, but encouraging agency. So that's certainly something I would stress. I would like to just also mention that the people coming into Britain, like from predominantly across the channel, are from Iran and Iraq. And about half of them get refugee status. So, which is really quite interesting, because there's a discourse about criminality and bogus migrants, but on the other hand, there's plenty of evidence that they are legitimate asylum seekers. I just wanted to throw that in.
Thank you. Well, let's take one more question before we break for lunch. I have from Kristin Yarris online. Kristin wonders if you ever find this line of argumentation and analysis, that is, that migration is a pursuit of aspirational features or a pursuit of well-being, runs counter to the forced migration arguments in ways that influence perceptions of deservingness and social care. That is, if we see migrants as aspiring humans, we might be moving away from a frame that emphasizes victimhood as the basis for claims for social and political inclusion. She's wondering your thoughts on that, on those tensions.
Yes, I appreciate the question, and it is a dilemma. I recall Jackie Baba from Harvard launched a report in Brussels on separated children some years ago, and was talking about this point, and basically the more one talks about agency and aspiration, the more it can challenge the very rationale, the very arguments for refugee status, which tends to be wrapped up in narratives often of victimhood. What I've argued for, I feel there's needs to be a new realism in the field, that there's very limited instances where it's just a case of pure flight. Often initially it's pure flight, but migration is also has an element of making decisions of to go somewhere. And I would argue that historically, that is a very, very human response to build the dreams of a life elsewhere, and shouldn't be at the expense of making a compelling case for asylum. I think a rounded human approach must take on board issues of aspiration, of dreams of a better future elsewhere.
All right. So just wanted to thank Tom, Alexis, and the conference organizers for allowing me this space to offer some of my reflections on work relevant for understanding the upstream institutional and organizational determinants of refugee health. And the talk here is a little bit different than the abstract submitted in the program, but I'm still drawing on work that I do here locally in Oregon. I'm based at the University of Oregon with asylum seeker resettlement networks, folks who I refer to as informal or volunteer humanitarians. So thank you everyone for joining after lunch, and it's very nice to be with you all. So drawing from my ongoing activist anthropological involvement with immigrant rights movements in Oregon, in this paper, I examine immigrant detention as one form of structural violence shaping unequitable access to opportunities for help among precariously statused migrants in the United States. A review of the history of immigrant detention reveals the ways that hierarchies of deservingness are built into carceral treatment of migrants by the US state. My ethnographic work with a local group of volunteers aiding asylum seekers in Oregon offers insights into how informal humanitarian efforts to assist refugees and other migrants may unwittingly reinforce these hierarchies, sorting different groups as more or less worthy of social care. The case study I draw upon in this paper comes from my ethnographic engagement with an all-volunteer group of local humanitarians that has mobilized since 2018 to aid asylum seekers, and who I refer to as the Oregon Asylum Network, or the Network. So after providing a brief background surrounding the group's formation, I will focus here on one specific dimension of their efforts, which is establishing a bond fund designed to release asylum seekers and other migrants from detention. Through a brief analysis of the dynamics surrounding the bond fund's deliberations over who to help, I show how local humanitarian relief efforts unwittingly reproduce the inequities embedded in state systems of migration governance. In both cases, formal, legal, and informal humanitarian, unequal hierarchies of care are built into immigration systems in ways that perpetuate legalized forms of violence. Hierarchies that are reinforced by humanitarian efforts and unwittingly foreclose opportunities for inclusion rather than contesting exclusionary laws, policies, and practices. Through this close attention to contested dynamics of asylum seeker governance, this paper casts a critical analysis on the policy, institutional, and organizational influences that shape opportunities for health and well-being of asylum seekers and precariously statused migrants. Situating my engaged ethnographic work with an activist immigration bond fund into this conversation about refugee health is part of the conceptual shift that I think many of the presentations since this morning have been making in such a productive way, a conceptual shift towards the structural and policy level factors that shape migrant health and well-being. In global public health, we would refer to this focus we would consider this focus as attending to upstream or macro level social determinants of health, the policy, legal, institutional, and community level nested influences on the health of individuals. Parsing out the nuances of immigration policy or federal rule changes and the ways immigration bureaucracies treat asylum seekers is analytically tedious and perhaps less ethnographically exciting than other forms of field-based research that some of us anthropologists long to do. However, anthropological analysis has a great deal to contribute to the critical, discursive, and what our friend Faye Harrison might argue is a much needed decolonizing perspective on the ways US immigration policies, past and present, reproduce racist and xenophobic constructions of belonging embedded into the structures of immigration governance. To frame immigrant detention as a structural determinant of health of migrants and asylum seekers is to consider a violent exclusionary feature of what Agamben and other social theorists would call the sovereign power of the state. We might also consider detention a form of political cruelty, which Cristina Beltran has recently argued is apparent in the ways in which white privilege in the United States relies on the unjust and cruel treatment of immigrants and thereby sustains what she calls white democracy. An outlier when considering the treatment of asylum seekers in global perspective, in the US, many asylum seekers are subjected to prolonged periods of detention as part of their journeys. While full exploration of detention as a tool of migration governance is beyond the scope of this paper, I will outline several key features of detention to provide a background for understanding the Oregon asylum network with which I work. Immigration detention in the US is a contested field. I'm sorry, I think I went one too far. Is a contested field deeply intertwined with a country's colonialist history and present-day carceral regimes of state power. Since the 19th century, the detention and forced removal of migrants in the US has reflected racialized notions of which migrants are deemed worthy of residing in the territory and which can be forcibly expelled or deported. For instance, in 1893, the US Congress gave immigration officers discretionary power to determine which migrants to detain and which to release, which began the system of bond payments to securitize migrants released from detention. This system of bond was further codified in the 1952 Immigration and Nationalization Act, and by the 1980s, the privatization of immigrant detention in the US began to expand exponentially, with the largest federal contracts made with the groups GEO, Corrections Corporations of America, now CCA, or CoreCivic. The immigration detention system has steadily expanded into the 21st century, with federal spending on these facilities topping $600 million by 2017. With over 200 immigrant detention centers, the US holds the nefarious distinction for having the most such facilities of any country in the world. Whether operated by private companies or municipal governments as jails, immigrant detention centers house different categories of displaced people, among them asylum seekers, undocumented migrants detained in the US interior, and all categories of immigrants deemed by ICE to having committed a fraction, even a minor one. Currently, an average length of stay in US immigration detention facilities is about a month. However, migrants may be released after a day, or they may be held for more than a year. Cases vary by facility, region, and the disposition or humors of immigration judges. While obtaining accurate and current information about immigrants held in detention is difficult, the Syracuse University hosted track system uses FOIA requests to make data on immigration courts and detention centers publicly available. It's a great resource. From track, we learned, for instance, that bond fees set by immigration judges vary widely by EOIR court, that's the Executive Office of Immigration Review, or immigration court. So these bond fees vary by court, region, and city, ranging from $1,000 to over $25,000, but the average is about $5,000 nationwide. To date, in 2021, there were 900, at last count, last time I checked track, 950,000 immigrants currently in detention seeking bond, and an estimated half will be granted release, just half. By nationality, the largest groups of immigrant granted release from detention are Mexican, Guatemalan, Salvadoran, and Honduran. Furthermore, according to track, the number of cases and average wait time for a case to be settled in EOIR court has steadily increased over the last 15 years, reaching a backlog of over 1 million cases by 2020, and average wait times today at about 1,000 days, or more than 3 years. That's for an asylum seeker placing their petition in court will have to wait more than 3 years for their merits hearing to determine their case. When faced with the realities of how capricious and cruel immigration, detention, and release decisions are, the volunteer humanitarians in the Oregon Asylum Network expressed bewilderment and disbelief. Network volunteers wish to identify some rational basis for why certain asylum seekers are admitted at the border without detention, why others might be released quickly with low bond, and others still detained for months without the possibility of bond at all. The capriciousness of asylum decisions seems to reflect a number of factors, among them individual border officers and immigration judges' prejudices, home country geopolitical affiliations with the United States, which partly explains, for instance, why Cubans or Nicaraguans are treated differently and detained with less regularity than Haitians or Hondurans, and gender and racialized ideas about deservingness, about which we've heard a little bit this morning. In the face of this uneven state application of any real rule of law, volunteer humanitarians' affective responses to the illogic of the immigration legal system belies what cultural theorist Lauren Ballant would have called cruel optimism, or sustaining belief among white liberals in a functioning, rational, transparent democratic state, even when faced with mounting evidence of the state's cruelty and capriciousness. So it's in this context that an Oregon network to aid asylum seekers was formed in 2018, when a group of concerned residents, some interfaith activists, some volunteers with refugee resettlement efforts, and some folks new to activism came together in the small city of Eugene, where I live and work, in response to the highly publicized groups of asylum seekers converging on the US-Mexico border, many of whom were traveling with the Caravanas de Migrantes through Mexico. And these caravanas used the media attention given to them, which was aggravated, of course, by our then president and his Twitter storms, to highlight their human right to asylum. As an activist, anthropologist, and feminist ethnographer engaged in ongoing research around immigrant rights organizing in Oregon, I participated regularly in meetings of this group of volunteer humanitarians across 2018 and 2019, taking notes, helping set up web pages, writing policy briefs, and presenting relevant information from my expertise in migration studies. My participation in the network waned across 2020. Meetings did go remote, and I've begun participating again. The initial impetus for the network was volunteers' sense, in their own words, that they just had to do something to aid asylum seekers, and many were mobilized by outrage at perceived unjust treatment of migrants and the mediatized images of migrants waiting at the US-Mexico border, some of which are on the slide for this conference. So by December 2018, several Eugene activists had joined mass mobilizations taking place in Tijuana and other border cities through organizing being done at the time by the New Sanctuary Movement and the Sanctuary Caravan, among other groups. While at the border, a number of local activists signed on to be sponsors for individual asylum seekers. This meant aiding asylum-seeking friends, as they called them, in filling out their I-589 forms, securing release from detention, and then later finding housing in Eugene and ultimately resettling in the local community. It became clear to volunteers that aiding individual asylum seekers involved a great investment of time, resources, and emotions. And they had to confront the reality of the high bond payments and exorbitant legal fees required to win a single asylum case against their desire to help many asylum-seeking people. So one subcommittee of this Oregon Asylum Network came to focus on establishing a bond fund in order to release asylum seekers from detention, which is called the Cascade Immigration Bond Fund. As I have been involved with the fund since its inception, I have observed some of the ways in which this humanitarian effort unwittingly reinforces troublesome hierarchies of deservingness and social care that are built into migration governance. For instance, in early meetings of the Bond Fund Committee, network volunteers joined staff of local nonprofit immigrant serving organizations, all of whom talking about the need to support the release from detention of all immigrants with ties to our local county, whether asylum seekers newly arriving from Central America or Mexican Americans undocumented but with longstanding family and employment ties to our county. Of course, Bond Fund Committee members recognize that in order to aid all immigrants with ties to our region currently in detention, a large amount of funds would be needed. Still, the intent of the Bond Fund at its inception was to be as inclusive as possible, encouraging donations and donors to consider all groups as equally worthy of freedom from detention. Because volunteers had little experience in the administrative bureaucracy required with releasing folks from detention, a partnership was formed with a Bay Area organization called Freedom for Immigrants, a 501c3 organization based in the Bay Area of San Francisco. This partnership had impacts both concrete and ideological. On the material level, network volunteers could encourage donations to FFI as tax deductible. And on an ideological basis, the FFI partnership tied the local bond fund to a broader national movement aimed at ending immigrant detention. Despite these activist and broadly inclusionary aims, fissures soon emerged within the bond fund, contradictions that mirror broader forms of state exclusion. A first question, how to determine eligibility for the fund, was intensely and is intensely considered to date. Some thought network-affiliated donors should be able to earmark donations to particular asylum seekers that network members were sponsoring. On the other hand, nonprofit staff working with long-standing immigrant serving organizations countered that donations should be pooled and that a fair and open application process with a transparent review committee representative of the different organizations involved should review applications and determine priority. Everyone involved recognized that the need for the fund would be greater than our ability to fundraise. However, volunteers were motivated by those exclusionary ideals that I mentioned earlier. The fissures encountered by the Bond Fund Committee revealed different ideas about who is deserving of assistance. In the face of high bond fees, network volunteers knew they needed to raise at least $10,000 before they could help any one individual. But so many immigrants in detention with ties to our county needed and still need help. This led to trying conversations in bond fund meetings where volunteers confronted the mismatch between the magnitude of need and their limited resources. A common refrain in meetings is, we just can't help everyone. So who would be helped? With their limited resources, CIBF, the fund, had capitalized to about $6,000 by December of 2019, so a year after its inception. The Bond Fund Committee made the decision to help asylum seekers sponsored by network volunteers. One argument made in behalf of this decision was that since network volunteers were doing most of the fundraising, their asylum-seeking friends should be prioritized. Deliberations over whether to help women and children over single men or relatives of asylum seekers already in Eugene continue, hotly debated topics. To date, just 2 individuals, both sponsored by network volunteers, have received Cascade Bond Fund assistance. With the volunteers currently in this moment focused on a renewed fundraising campaign, these questions over who to help are likely to reemerge, and responses will reflect the troubling realities of limited resources and the capricious humanitarian calculations about who is most worthy of care. Perhaps unwittingly, the volunteer humanitarians involved with the bond fund are participating then in a troubling reinforcement of state systems of migration governance and enforced exclusion, reinscribing troubling hierarchies of deservingness and care. These fissures are illustrative of broader issues of deservingness central to critical humanitarian studies, arguments that my friend Charles Waters made earlier. To sum up, this question might be posed as, who decides which migrants are morally worthy of inclusion and social care? And this question leads me to another, which is what might an alternative to exclusion and political cruelty look like when facing the vast needs of forcibly displaced migrants against the limitations of resources and care that exist? Or put another way, rather than reinforcing exclusionary narratives of state and legal regimes of migration management, how can volunteer humanitarian efforts like the one I profile here use local activism to broaden the boundaries of membership, inclusion, and citizenship? I think one possibility comes from this bond fund work, where advocacy groups like Freedom for Immigrants configure the work of aiding individual migrants in their search for release from detention as part of a broader political aim of ending all immigrant detention and all carceral systems of state treatments of migrants. So with that, I'll end, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yarris. And I just wanted to repeat your introduction briefly. I don't think that it was heard by our attendees online. So Dr. Yarris is Associate Professor of Global Studies at the University of Oregon, and we certainly appreciate your talk today. So I just wanted to open it up for some question and answers.
Hi, Kristin. This is Catherine. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Catherine.
Oh, hi. This might be a quite naive question, but I'm always struck when I talk to humanitarian workers that the issue of triaging according to need is non-problematic, because that's what needs to be done to save lives. The way you portray it, it's very deeply problematic to look at hierarchies of deservingness and suffering. But can you tell me a little bit why triage in a humanitarian crisis situation is not problematic, and why it becomes problematic when you're moving into a state that has resources for all and where the social contract is weak? I'm still trying to kind of figure this out.
Your question is articulate, and I'm not sure my response will be as articulate as your question is.
I'm saying is the reason why triage here is so problematic because we have the resources and a social contract to look after people, and then it's not so problematic in a crisis situation where humanitarian first responders are trained to triage according to need. In other words, we seem to be making that problematic. But what I'm saying is, in conversation with humanitarians, that's never necessarily problematic in itself.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I do understand the question. And I'm wondering about this in relationship to the question I posed in response to Charles's talk before lunch. That is, how do we imagine migrants as maybe equally deserving and aspirational subjects, and yet recognize the limitations of humanitarian efforts to aid them? And I can only respond to this in terms of what, in this particular ethnographic case, there was a moment of opportunity, I think, to transcend some of these hierarchies that I'm describing in the paper, that was foreclosed upon. And I think it's foreclosure. Actually, I've written about this a little more. I didn't have time to read it all. It's foreclosure that is an opportunity for a much broader conceptualization of who was deserving in this case and who who are the members of our local immigrant community. That foreclosure hinged on issues of race, class, and gender in really troubling ways at a particular moment in the bond fund's origin story, if you will. And so all I'll say without going into that in ethnographic detail is that there was a moment in which these folks decided that the newcomers, were more worthy than the long-standing migrants. And it was kind of an explicit decision, but it was contested by nonprofit staff, themselves largely Latinx, and many of whom young women of color, who pushed back on this narrative of who needed to be helped. And I think that was really unfortunate because at that moment, there was a refugee resettlement coalition at the table. There was a social service organization serving our Latinx communities at the table. And then there was this new emergence of new activists at the table. And when that decision was made, that coalition fell apart. So I don't know, I can only sort of respond in terms of that ethnographic case, but I'm also trying to imagine humanitarian futures in which we don't have to triage in this way, and all people are worthy of membership. And I know that's like very idealistic configuration, but I think that's where my thinking goes along these lines.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
I have a question about the current situation in Oregon in terms of the different populations that are there and arriving. Who are the people who are coming most right now, and what are the main populations of immigrants, or what are the main immigrant communities there currently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. It's quite diverse, and it depends on county and region. So folks arriving officially categorized as refugee right now, there's a new wave of Afghanis who are being brought by the official refugee resettlement channels. There's a long-standing refugee resettlement channel into the Portland area, folks from all over Africa. And so there's a strong African refugee community there and refugee serving organizations serving African refugees. And in my county, there's it's like a mixed flow of Central Americans, including a number of indigenous Hmong-speaking folks from Guatemala who work. They're brought here through agricultural labor streams. So they look like economic migrants, but they're applying for asylum once here. So people refer to them as refugees. So these categories don't really match people's realities. The folks at the Asylum network that I work with are resettling are largely Central American, because it tends to be that Mexicans are getting released. Mexicans seeking asylum are getting released without detention or without bond. And so Mexicans are arriving here as asylum seekers, but they're not needing the help of this network in the way that Central Americans are. So, and then of course we have long-standing communities of Mexican American immigrants and new waves of folks from California who are being pushed north by climate change and labor migration.
Okay, so now I would like to introduce our next set of speakers. They are Kristin Assefa, who is a PhD student in the Ethnic Studies Department at UC San Diego, and Andrew Blank, who is an MPH and intern at the UC San Diego Refugee Health Unit in San Diego, California. And the title of their talk today is Refugee Collaboration and Self-Determination in San Diego. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having us, for giving us this opportunity to share with you today. My name is Andrew Blank. I earned my Master of Public Health from the University of Southern California. And while I was there, I supported the UC San Diego Refugee Health Unit in building and leading the San Diego Refugee Communities Coalition through COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm joined by Kristin Assefa, a PhD student in the Ethnic Studies Department at UC San Diego. And through a grant from the Critical Refugee Studies Collective, Kristin participated in a community-based participatory approach ethnographic project with the SDRCC that included 12 oral histories with the organizational members of our coalition. So we're honored to be able to share this story with you today. And next slide, please. So today our objectives in the first half, I'll talk a little bit about just the SDRCC as a concept, how it was formed, who comprises it, and just a couple of projects to give you a little bit of insight into how this program is implemented. And then I'll turn it over to Kristin, who will share a lot of her research about the model of our coalition and a lot of the ideas that our coalition is built upon and why it has proved to be successful over the past couple of years. So San Diego is home to about 40% of refugees who have come into California in the last couple of decades, including 23,000 refugees resettled since 2009. And so in response to that, there are a number of ethnic community-based organizations that serve specific refugee communities inside San Diego. And so in 2019, we formed a coalition of about 11 or 12 of those ethnic community-based organizations in order to collectively support refugee communities and to make sure that they are healthy, safe, and thriving. So that's the mission of the SDRCC. We lead a coordinated approach to collectively reduce health and socioeconomic disparities among all those diverse refugee communities that we serve in San Diego. And like a number of other people have shared today, that includes refugees from a number of different locations all around the world, including the Middle East, North and East Africa, and all over Asia and Central and South America. Next slide, please. So one of the projects that we worked on as soon as COVID kind of started and made an impact in San Diego was a community impact report. And so we were able to collectively use the different relationships that we had through our ethnic community-based organizations and the networks that we formed, the trust that we had with our community, in order to conduct a pretty comprehensive survey of how the pandemic was specifically impacting refugee communities in San Diego. And so that assessment covered over 300 families in 12 languages. Those families came from 18 different countries. It included both kind of a traditional survey and focus group sessions. Interviews were conducted both over the phone and in person. And we covered a wide range of topics, including the social determinants of health and equity and how COVID-19 was impacting different parts of people's lives. And what this really did for us was we were able to look at ideas like health, employment, housing, education, social networks, and come up with data about how the pandemic was impacting refugees. And we could take that data and go directly to the county or the city or the state and advocate for specific policies. So we could say, hey, we just learned that 30% of San Diego's refugees were not able to make their rent payment due to COVID-19's impact on employment. So we, based on that data, are advocating that we extend an eviction moratorium, or we could argue for more support in terms of mental health or in terms of technological training to help parents who are trying to help their children at home with some of the technical requirements needed for distance education. So this impact was pretty instrumental in us being able to advocate locally, and it was picked up, gave us a lot of good media coverage in order to generate interest and support from throughout the community to advocate for refugees. And then another major project that is still ongoing today and has been going for the last 2 years or so is the COVID-19 Communication and Health Outreach Initiative. So this was funding that we were able to get through the county to use the community health worker model, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The community health worker model is especially appropriate for communities that are maybe harder to reach for a number of different reasons. In our case, there's a history of systemic racism in this country. There's legitimate concerns about vaccines or about health and medical experimentation among Black and Brown communities. There's a language barrier. There are cultural differences. There are concerns about immigration status or documentation status. And so for a number of reasons, traditional messaging from, say, the county health department might not be the most effective way to reach these communities. But instead, what we can do is train community health workers who are members of that community who may or may not have formal medical training necessarily, but we can teach them what it is that those key topics need to be taken into the community. So through this program, we had trainings every week where we would meet with about 30 different community health workers from our different community-based organizations. We would teach them about COVID-19, how to prevent it, what the testing policies were locally, where to get tested, that it was free, those kinds of ideas. what to expect with contact tracing, that people shouldn't be afraid, that it's not like a police interrogation when someone's asking where you've been or who you've been spending time with, and it's not something that's going to come with criminal offenses, but it's something that is trying to keep people safe, and how to treat COVID-19 and what to expect. There's also, for a number of the reasons I mentioned earlier, a lot of concerns about vaccines. So as those began to emerge, there was a lot of work that went into educating the community about why it was safe and making sure that those communities were represented in the trials that were ongoing. We also talked a lot about state and local policies. Policies have been changing constantly since the outbreak of the pandemic, and there's a lot of confusing and constantly changing terminology. So we wanted to make sure that people understood what they were allowed to do, how they could operate their businesses or places of worship, what different color codes maybe meant or tiers, and how those were changing. We also treated our community health workers as we invested in them personally and professionally. So we tried to educate them about how they could grow. So we did trainings on ideas like time management, and really saw a lot of growth in our community health workers as they were able to rally around this outreach initiative. And they took a lot of pride in the support that they were able to provide to their communities. One other idea that we had that was successful was finding and creating a collection of resources that were specific to refugee communities that were appropriate in terms of health literacy, both in language and kind of the cultural influences that went into some of the messaging. And so we were able to take different tools from around the country, put them all in a shared Google Doc, and that was much easier for our community health workers to navigate than trying to themselves go to the state or the CDC or the WHO to find resources.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was great. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristin Assefa, and I am a PhD candidate in Ethnic Studies and Critical Gender Studies here at UCST. And I'm thrilled to be here and to share a bit about the oral histories I conducted with the San Diego Refugee Communities Coalition in the spring of 2021. To start out, I just want to say that as a scholar of ethnic studies, critical refugee studies, and also Black diaspora studies, my work is largely interested in the knowledge production that emerges from refugee communities. So my approach to this particular project, has largely been guided by one, a desire to give primacy to the interests of the coalition. And so in practice, that meant that all of the questions that shaped this oral history were developed in collaboration with members of the coalition. And secondly, this project is also guided by a desire to really identify the material and epistemological stakes that manifest through the work that the SDRCC is doing, which has really been transformative for the community organizing landscape here in the region. The SDRCC is doing something really unique. They've developed a multiracial, multicultural, refugee, and Black-led coalition that has been at the forefront of addressing the needs of refugee families during COVID-19. So, by centering collaboration, culturally competent care, and empowerment, the SDRCC has really done something powerful here. And, rather than reinscribing refugees as helpless figures in need of aid, services, or rescue, they really center the leadership of refugees and recognize that refugees themselves have a unique capacity and ability to serve their communities. So in this presentation, I'm going to highlight 3 key elements that define the SDRCC model. And I'm drawing from the oral histories I conducted with member leaders of the coalition. And I'll also share some definitions of community health that emerged through my conversations with the members of the coalition, to talk about, what is unique about the coalition and why the SDRCC and the work that they are doing is an important site of knowledge production that really produces a vision for a future in which all people, are treated with care and dignity. So the 3 key elements that define the SDRCC model and inform its capacity to directly meet the needs of refugee families in San Diego County are one, shared understanding, two, a desire to take collective action, and three, a collaborative, participatory decision-making model. As Andrew said earlier, the SDRCC is comprised of 11 ethnic-based community organizations. And as refugees themselves, or children of refugees, or also immigrants, everyone sort of holds different like immigration or migrant status in the coalition. But all the members of the coalition intimately know the unique set of challenges that forcibly displaced communities experience. Members of the coalition recognize and understand the generational impact of forced displacement as an ongoing process rather than a singular event or something that can be limited to someone's legal status. Further, they also recognize how the refugee experience is shaped by different historical and social processes, such as Islamophobia and anti-Black racism. So this intimate understanding the members of the coalition share produces a sense of mutuality that guides the programs and services that they provide as a collective. And as Andrew said, there are a lot of community health programs, and over the course of the last year and a half, the SDRCC has provided, rental assistance, translation services, community health education, crisis intervention, vaccination drives, and also mutual aid, like straight up rental assistance to help folks in the community. And this is something that's also really important about the work of the SDRCC. This shared understanding that they have really expands the breadth of their work. Rather than approaching their work as a single issue struggle, there's a broad array of work that's led by the individual organizations. So for example, one member organization of the SDRCC is License to Freedom, which is the only refugee-led organization that addresses domestic violence in San Diego County. So they really provide wraparound services for those who are experiencing domestic violence that can range from legal support to wellness and counseling support and financial assistance. Another organization is the Partnership of the Advancement of New Americans, known as PANA. They are youth-led advocacy organizations that are leading campaigns around redistricting, refugee resettlement, and policing in San Diego County. Lastly, another organization that I'll highlight just to give you an understanding of how this is a multi-issue sort of organization. Another member org is the Haitian Bridge Alliance, which is, they're really at the forefront nationally of advocacy for Black refugees and asylum seekers. Currently, Haitian Bridge Alliance is leading, like I said, national campaigns to extend TPS for Haitian refugees. They're leading advocacy campaigns to end Title 42, while also working to meet the needs of Black refugees and asylum seekers both in Tijuana and San Diego. So the second key point about the FDC model that I'd like to emphasize is their desire to take collective action. So while each organization organizes individual programs and initiatives, they recognize the power in joining forces to collectively meet the material needs of the broader refugee community in San Diego County. The coalition really values the leadership and expertise of each member organization, and this appreciation for autonomy is reflected in their understanding of the implications of what it means to be a refugee-led organization in a nonprofit landscape that is proliferated by well-meaning but often not community-based or refugee-led organizations, right? So the coalition exists as a site of autonomy and leadership for refugees who are committed to serving their communities, making an impact, and also developing their leadership. The members of the SDRCC recognize that the problems faced by their community are not individual failings, but a result of larger social and political issues. So they create space where refugees are empowered to collectively organize and again, provide basic needs for their communities, as well as advocacy. And lastly, the other sort of defining aspect of the SDRCC model is their collaborative, participatory decision-making process. So this stems from a shared understanding and a shared set of values that are rooted in a desire, right, for their communities to be given, the interests of their communities to be given primacy. So the coalition has really succeeded at, developing a humble workspace environment where people are reliable, consistent, and present. And one key aspect to their collaborative and participatory model is their commitment to mentorship. So the goal for the coalition is not for everyone to be an expert at all things, but for the skills of different orgs to complement one another and build towards shared growth and development. This is an intergenerational coalition. There are some orgs that have been around, organizing in San Diego since the early 90s, while others have been established, in the last year or two, as a result of, more recently, as a result of the arrival of Afghani refugees in San Diego. There are some Afghan-led EDCOs that have recently joined the SDRCC. So, there's a broad range of organizations within the coalition, and therefore the coalition has become a site of exchange where people are, providing skills, information, advice, and support to one another based off of their experiences living and working in San Diego, and also out of a desire to see a new generation of leaders emerge who can continue to lead and grow this work in the future. And lastly, it's a consensus-driven decision-making model. Member orgs can step back when they need to, when they feel that a program, grant, or initiative would be repetitive for them, or they simply don't have capacity, but there are regular meetings where proposals emerge, are discussed, modified, and finalized. So, the SDRCC, another key aspect of their work is that they are really reimagining community health, right? So they shift away from narratives about health disparities or health inequities that oftentimes center solutions for these issues in the hands of healthcare providers or institutions, but instead, the SDRCC is displaying that impacted communities can be the drivers for solutions and transformations regarding the most pressing needs. And so the SDRCC model is a really valuable site of knowledge production where these alternative definitions of community health emerge and really drive the scope of their work. And it's a site where racialized ideas of refugees are really being contested, and a framework for a way of coexistence that is defined by collaboration and cares really being put forth. So to close out, I'd like to just share some quotes from some of the oral histories I conducted. The prompt or the question that prompted these responses was largely, it was either what does community health mean to you in your community, or what does a healthy community look like to you? So I'll just read the bolded part of this quote. Someone says, I want to go home and I don't want to be attacked for being a Muslim and walking on the city of Main Street. I want to be accepted. Health means the small city, the mayor, the school, the businesses, all together has to work in a good system, and I have to be a part of that system in order to balance these things. In another interview, someone said, health means government, it means president, political, it means a newspaper, it means street driving, it means enough services, it means me being able to connect and to make good decisions. But how can I make a good decision if everything around me is not good, is not healthy? Here, we had someone say, health is not just about when you're sick and you get a place to get help, but it's also every single moment of your life you have support, emotional support, and someone you can rely on. So community health can be about your family, about your friends, it could be about ECBOs. I consider everybody as a community health worker. And another part of this quote that really resonated with me is, they're saying, community health is, if you have a tie to your own culture or heritage, and then if you can embrace your own culture in this new country, then you feel proud of your own culture. That is a very important part of your health. And lastly, here, someone says, community health looks like material security, and beyond that, it's also the agency to make choices in life and the agency to fulfill your full potential. So I'll just close with those definitions of community health and what health looks like that came directly from refugee families here in San Diego County. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. Let's turn it over for questions. Yes.
I thought that was a great talk, and I really appreciated the focus on agency and empowerment and community-driven initiatives. And so I'm very interested in what's going on in the state of California around the formal system recognizing the power of community health workers. So could the two of you talk a little bit about what that looks like at this time under your state health insurance plan? What services are reimbursable when done by community health workers, and what are opportunities beyond, anti-vaccine attitudes or hesitancy for other things like behavioral health and prevention services?
Andrew, do you have a response to that question?
I would need to do some work to get you a good answer on that question. I'd be happy to look into it. I know that certainly is the vision. The dream is to continue expanding community health worker work to encompass more than just direct pandemic response. And that's a lot of the shift that our coalition's been trying to make in the last 6 months or so, is not just to be kind of frontline healthcare workers, but to also be advocating for policy changes and those sorts of things. And that would certainly require being reimbursed and those kinds of ideas for something other than just a vaccine drive. So, but in terms of what specifically is being reimbursed right now or the state policy, I'll have to get back to you on that. But thank you for asking.
Are there other questions?
I have a question. So thank you. I was thinking back to the discussion about the bond fund and just how contentious the discussions were within that group of organizers, trying to decide, who should be prioritized. And then thinking of that in contrast to the way that you were describing sort of the really good, solidarity and collaboration between quite disparate groups. I'm just curious, was it really that smooth? And what's the basis for coalition between such different groups? And weren't there different interests? Weren't there really different things that those groups wanted to prioritize? And how did they really find a way? What was the access that drew them together for collaboration instead of each group organizing indigenously within themselves, for their own organizations and work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that, in any coalition, there are challenges. Collaborative work is never smooth, but to answer your question about why work in collaboration versus working in silos, that was a question that, I really asked a lot of folks, like, what is your investment in being in a coalition? And the reality is, multiple folks cited, one, like the challenges in funding. A lot of these ethnic-based community organizations have never received any type of grant or financial support to be able to keep their doors open. A lot of folks were working and paying out of their own pocket for a space, a place for their communities to meet, and working with very limited budgets to provide services and programs for their communities. And so a lot of folks recognize the strength in numbers simply when it comes to trying to secure grant funds, right? That there was a larger opportunity for them to receive funding and expand their programs and maintain a physical site where the community members could come and be together if they worked in coalition with other refugee communities in the region. And a lot of them actually knew each other by participating in programs that were led by, more larger, well-financed refugee-serving organizations in San Diego, but felt that oftentimes their interests were put to the side, that the programs that they participated in required that they fulfill the demands of a grant rather than actually being rooted in the desires and needs of their local communities. So this was also really a struggle for agency. And members of the coalition recognized that being together and working together in coalition would allow them to challenge, the nonprofit landscape of the region that oftentimes put their interests and their agency secondary to the demands of funders and other political players. So that was really the driving factor for why folks decided to work in collaboration and continue to do so. Andrew, is there anything else you'd add to that?
No, that's perfect. I agree. Yeah.
I have a question about the racialization of refugee communities. When we think about that process, it's usually in terms of the racialization of refugees in public opinion or the racialization of refugees by government policy. But what about in a collaborative context among communities? Is there an absence of racialization, or is there an underlying dynamic of racializing one another?
That's a really good question. And that's one that, I continue to think carefully about and unpack, because the reality is that there is a US racial structure, right, that exists, a US racial formation that doesn't translate to the experiences of forcibly displaced communities who are coming from completely different, religious, racial, cultural contexts. So that's a really, I think, critical question for us to think about when we work with forcibly displaced communities. It's not just how are refugees fitting into US racial structures, but what are the racial formations from their homelands that they also bring with them. In the context of the San Diego Refugees Communities Coalition, I found that the experience of displacement was the primary social status that united folks. But there was an acknowledgement of the different impacts of race, the impact of different types of oppression that members of the coalition experience. For example, in one of the quotes, one of the members is citing Islamophobia, right, as a racializing experience, an othering experience that is unique to the Muslim members of the coalition. Whereas in one of my interviews with Gwendolyn Joseph from Haitian Bridge Alliance, she was speaking specifically to the anti-Black nature of some immigration policies, such as Title 42, but also the anti-Blackness that emerges in the immigration justice movement, both locally and nationally in the United States, where there's a large focus of immigration advocacy for Mexican or Central American refugees and asylum seekers, while Black refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers are oftentimes left out or not considered. So there are multiple ways in which the racialization of refugees is emerging through the coalition. And the way that it's addressed is that members of the coalition, support one another's ongoing campaigns, whether that's an advocacy campaign or a program. But I think that for future directions of my own work, and I think future directions of the coalition as well, there are definitely questions to unpack about both the intra-community impacts of race and difference and culture, in addition to the broader systemic issues that they face in the United States as refugees.